Hello, my name's Tim Addy, and this is the first in a series of videos exploring the philosophy of the Platonic tradition. Note that it's the tradition, the philosophy of the tradition, not the philosophy of Plato, since the Platonic tradition includes but is much more than just Plato or even Plato and Socrates. It's a tradition which can be traced back to at least 600 BC and onwards through Plato's time to the middle of the 6th century AD. So 11 or 1200 years of a tradition handed on from teacher to pupil, from one generation to the next, a set of broadly agreed philosophic positions which some of the greatest minds of antiquity contribute to. Before we begin, two warnings. The first is, of course, this is my own understanding of that philosophy, a profound and complex philosophy, and I'm sure some of the things I'm going to be saying could be better said, and indeed some of the things I'm going to say over the course of these videos will probably be outright wrong. I carry on with confidence though, because one of the teachings of the Platonic tradition is that every affirmation or negation needs to be examined by the hearer and questioned, that nobody else's opinion about what's philosophically true is a finishing point, maybe a good starting point, but not a finishing point. And that applies not only to me, but also to Plato. What he suggests, what any of the characters in his dialogue suggests, are positions to be considered by you. And the second warning is that the long gap between the end of what one might call the Platonic Golden Age, the closure of the academies in the middle of the 6th century AD to now, has allowed a lot of drift in our understanding of particular words or particular concepts, and we're going to have to make allowances for that. And indeed, many of the ideas of the Platonic tradition have been profoundly neglected over those intervening centuries, and so I would ask you to give the ideas put forward, as alien as some of them may sound, some time to settle in the mind. So, in between, as I say, that the closure of the academies and now, many things have happened, and there have been really two major revolutions in the way the West thinks. The first was brought about by the arrival of Christianity, or to be more accurate, that form of Christianity which was acceptable and in the end backed by the Roman state, the Roman Empire, which evolves into a long period of church domination, putting forward a creed for everyone to believe in. And the second revolution was marked by what's called the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, where the authority of the church was disputed, and in its place the view that reason was the better arbiter of truth. Both of those revolutions in thought have tended to exteriorize our point of thought, our point of focus of thought, so to speak. With Christianity, it's because of the emphasis that they put on the historical fact of the birth, life, death and resurrection of Jesus, which they would claim is a divine incarnation, as a unique moment in history. The other revolution exteriorizes our thought because the form of reason that the age of reason upholds is so tied to sense perception and the testing of truth by empiric means. In other words, grounding truth in material reality rather than immaterial reality. Both of those trends in Western thought change our understanding, have changed our understanding of what philosophy is. Philosophy, after all, sits between the thinker and reality, and both our views of reality and our views of ourself have been changed by those two revolutions. So, what I'm going to say will be a radical revision or even a radical reversion to a former understanding of philosophy, an understanding of philosophy by its founders. So let's go back to Parmenides. Parmenides, like all the other philosophers that come before Socrates, they're known as pre-Socratics. His writing is fragmentary. It comes to us in fragmentary form. Quotes by later writers, quoting earlier philosophers, is all that's left to us. The useful thing about Parmenides is that some of the fragments are quite long, and although he writes in a very compressed and one might almost say mystical way, at least the length of the fragments allow us to explore, to a certain extent, his views. He's also useful because he establishes a distinction between what he calls the way of truth and the way of seeming, which Plato and all those who follow after him in the tradition take as an obvious way of dividing up our views of reality. So let me begin by reading a few lines from the first fragment of Parmenides' poem, which was entitled On Nature. In it, he begins by explaining that he rides a chariot, was met by the daughters of the sun, and guided downwards to the gates at which the paths of night and day meet. Through the gates they drive him, and this is what he says at this point. Then the maidens steered the carriage and the horses straight through the gates and down the road. The goddess received me kindly, taking in her hand my right hand. She spoke and addressed me with these words: Youth, you have reached my abode as the companion of immortal charioteers and of the mares which carry you. You are welcome. It was no ill fate that prompted you to travel this way, which is indeed far from mortal men, beyond their beaten paths. No, it was right and justice. You must learn everything, both the steady heart of well-rounded truth and the belief of mortals in which there is no true trust. So, as I say, what Parmenides is taught by the goddess and explores in his poem is the way of truth and the way of seeming. From one point of view, philosophy is just this: the path by which truth is discovered, and the way of seeming is exposed for what it is. Plato and all who work in the tradition will take this fundamental distinction and explore the consequences of it. But although the insistence that the true philosopher keeps his inner eye on intelligible, real being, that is to say, eternal, stable truth, that lies at the heart of true philosophy, we must note how Parmenides frames this foundational affirmation. The whole of the first fragment of the poem is really about the experience the effects of the experience of the pursuit of truth, that it is a transformative activity which takes the philosopher far from the beaten paths of men, that it's an approach to divinity and a communion with a goddess, who is beyond the paths of light and day. The philosopher who is thus initiated arrives not by ill fate, that is to say, the comings and goings of the material world, the tides of fortune and misfortune, but, the goddess tells him, by right and justice. That very act of treading the path makes him or her the companions of immortal charioteers. This is the primary characteristic of true philosophy. It transforms the seeking soul and allows her to discover her own inherent immortality, her own divinity. In the West, Platonism is the most highly developed exploration of this path. It has more in common with Eastern spiritual disciplines than it does with the rather shadowy philosophies now current in the West, where largely thinkers build up their sandcastles, leave them there as monuments to themselves, waiting for the next generation to rather kick it over and start afresh. That is the ill fate of the material world. Everything arises into a state of maturity and then perishes. The Platonic Path particularly builds on the understanding of our predecessors. It's not an attempt to kick over their truths, but to build on the truths that they have seen, which indeed, strictly speaking, are the truths that we see, since they're eternal. It's the effect of the pursuit of truth which is so important to the tradition. Philosophy, in this respect, is the recovery of the soul by the soul, the means by which we bring into light and into conscious activity our divine substratum, a substratum which at present for most of us is covered over by forgetfulness and confusion. Philosophy, literally the love of wisdom, is the cultivation of that wisdom which addresses our curious state, divine creatures who must work to recover and make actual that divinity. It indeed is the one art which cannot be neglected. Socrates in his trial puts it most starkly. The unreflective life is not lived. Those who traverse the passage from birth to death without philosophy are not living a life, they're living a dream. I do, of course, want to expand the meaning of philosophy beyond the formality that the present day understands philosophy to be. In the Republic, Socrates says, "The philosopher who converses with that which is orderly and divine, as far as possible for a human, becomes himself orderly and divine." So what's happening here? Why does the Platonic tradition see philosophy in these terms? It's foundational to the Platonic tradition that the soul possesses the intelligible world, all the eternal ideas of the intelligible world, as a perfect image in herself. That real being and the light of the truth is not something outside, but in reality is to be found within, rooted in the very nature of the soul, that is to say, in the very nature of the human self. So this is Proclus, putting it beautifully in his commentary on the first book of Euclid. The soul, therefore, is by no means to be compared to a smooth writing tablet, void of all reasons, but she is an ever-written tablet, herself inscribing the characters in herself, of which she derives an eternal plenitude from intellect. For soul is a certain subordinate intellect, revolving round an intellect prior to herself, formed to its image and participating its divine irradiations. Intellect here is understood by Proclus to be the living substantiality of eternity. Intellect simply knows. It knows all things at once. The soul, as a participant in intellect, also knows, but it knows in an ordered sequence. The closer the soul gets to intellect proper, the more does it participate in simple knowledge rather than sequential knowledge. The inscription of the characters by the soul on itself, which Proclus talks about, is accomplished by thinking on and living with the eternal forms, which the philosopher contemplates when looking to intellect. It is the act of bringing those forms into activity by living according to thoughtful virtue which is the mark of the philosophic life. As Porphyry says, beatific contemplation does not consist in the accumulation of arguments or a storehouse of learned knowledge, but in us theory must become nature and life itself. The effect of embracing the real, in the Symposium Plato calls it the beautiful, is transformative. It's also, in that dialogue, the Symposium, linked to virtue. The central speech of the Symposium is a report by Socrates of Diotima's initiation of him into the mysteries of love and beauty. He recalls her teaching, and his speech culminates with these words of hers. Perceive you not that in beholding the beautiful with that eye with which alone it is possible to behold it, thus and thus only could a man ever attain to generate, not the images or semblances of virtue, as not having his intimate commerce with an image or a semblance, but virtue true, real and substantial, from the converse and embraces of that which is real and true. Thus begetting true virtue, and bringing her up till she is grown mature, he would become a favourite of the gods, and at length would be, if any man ever be, himself one of the immortals. In the next video we will consider why Plato puts so much emphasis on the Delphic exhortation, know thyself. But we can see here, I think, the outlines of why this should be. If it's true that within the self itself is a compendium of all the eternal ideas of divine intellect, which by their beauty and power have brought the great cosmos into existence, it shouldn't be a surprise if the contemplation of our own internal reflections of those ideas produces into fullness the little cosmos which is our soul unfolded. Its transformative power is remarked on by Timaeus in the dialogue that's named after him. He says, "We are not terrestrial plants, but blossoms of heaven. And this indeed is most truly asserted. For, from whence the first generation of the soul arose, from thence a divine nature, being suspended from our head and root, directs and governs the whole of our corporeal frame. In him, therefore, who vehemently labours to satisfy the cravings of desire and ambition, all the conceptions of his soul must be necessarily mortal, and himself, as much as possible, must become entirely mortal, since he leaves nothing unaccomplished, which tends to increase his perishable part. But it is necessary that he who is sedulously employed in the acquisition of knowledge, who is anxious to acquire the wisdom of truth, and who employs his most vigorous exertions in this one pursuit, it is perfectly necessary that such a one, if he touches on the truth, should be endued with wisdom about immortal and divine concerns, and that he should participate of immortality as far as human nature permits, without leaving any part of it behind. So, we are, according to Platonic philosophy, immortal creatures. But it is one thing to be an immortal, and another thing to know that one is immortal. Until we genuinely know that we are immortal, we cannot act as an immortal. That is why every great writer who followed Plato in the philosophic tradition of the ancient world addresses the reader as a soul who is to go through a profound process of self-transformation, if you like, self-creation. It is on this basis that these introductory videos are made. So let me end with an example of one of the sages of the tradition, having spent a large part of a treatise examining the nature of beauty. He turns, so to speak, right at the end, from looking at that to looking at us, eye to eye, holding our attention and speaking to us with these words. Withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. He cuts away here, he smooths there. He makes this line lighter, this other purer, until a lovely face has grown upon his work. So do you also. Cut away all that is excessive, straighten all that is crooked, bring light to all that is overcast. Labour to make all one glow of beauty, and never cease chiselling your statue until there shall shine out on you from it the godlike splendour of virtue, until you shall see temperance herself enthroned on her holy seat. If you become thus purified, residing in yourself, and having nothing any longer to impede this unity, and no further mixture is to be found within, but perceiving your whole self to be a true light, open now your inner eye, for with the intellectual eye alone can such immense beauty be perceived.